next 8 weeks or so, we're going to be dealing with the family. A little later on, as we move into Mother's Day and looking forward to Father's Day, we will be dealing with those aspects of the physical family. But for a few Sundays, I want to really talk from my heart to you, my extended family, and I'm part of your family, the family of God. Last week I dealt with that, sharing that we needed to learn not only to love each other in this family, but also to share in responsibilities as well as in the joys of the Lord. Today I want to share something with you that is of what I would say of grave concern to me about the family of God, not only here, but I think perhaps all through evangelical Christianity. And that is that I sense that there is an element of softness that almost is equated with a weakness in the body of Christ that is debilitating and actually frightening. You've heard it said before that a Christian ought to be like a good pair of leather gloves, soft and tough. Well, I would like to change those two words just a little and talk about the Christian life as being tough and tender. And there must be that balance. Even as you read the words of the Apostle Paul, there are various scriptures that I could point out to you, such as in the Corinthian letter, when he wrote them in the 8th chapter and told them, he says, I cannot commend you in this, talking about an activity that was taking place in the church. In another section, he says, I've heard that there are divisions among you, and I partly believe it. Over in the book of Philippians, we hear him speaking about two ladies in the church, Euodia and Syntyche, that he says, I want you to admonish them to agree together in the Lord. Now, I think he was just trying to be skillful there. I believe there were two ladies that were really, at each other. And he was just saying, would you kindly tell Mary and Hazel to get their act together? Okay? You see this degree of toughness in Paul's writings to the churches that he loved. He didn't just sweep it under the rug and pretend that it didn't exist. He said, you need to learn to be tough. On the other hand, the book of Philippians about Epaphroditus, who had been so ill, even to the point that he was fearful that he would die, and I catch a tenderness there. I see him on the banks of the river as he'd been at the church at Ephesus for about 2 years, and as he got ready to pull out to leave them and never see their face again, the church gathered around him, they hugged him, they kissed him, they wept. There I see tenderness. Here I see a man that was not afraid to really equip the church in helping them to understand that they needed to be both tough and tender. And I believe in our day we need those qualities very desperately. Now, when I talk about toughness in the church, I'm not talking about meanness. Heard a story not long ago of this fellow in the Klondike, went into a sort of a lean-to kind of a bar, and here were all these rough Alaskans. And the fellow said, is there anybody in here that owns a mean-looking, raw-boned husky out there? The fellow says, yeah, that's my dog. He says, watch him, he's ferocious. He said, well, sir, I hate to tell you. He says, but my dog just killed your dog. He said, what do you mean killed my dog? He's the most ferocious dog in this area. He whips them all. He says, well, I can't help it. My dog just killed your dog. He said, well, what kind of a dog do you have anyway? He says, I've got a Chihuahua. He said, you mean a Chihuahua killed my husky? He said, yeah. He said he got caught in his throat and he choked to death. big difference between being mean and being tough. Let me tell you, these are tough times. Lots of pressures on the church. Lots of pressures on you. You know that as well as I do. And we need to learn to be tough and tender. Charles Swindoll, recently addressing a group of us preachers, said, God forbid that we would ever raise a generation of preachers who cannot weep. We have enough prophets, he said. What we now need is pastors. Then I again reread a line or two out of Don Baker's book that I quoted from last week when they began the very difficult task of discipline in the body of an errant member of the church, a leading pastor on staff. And he pulled his staff members together and said, gentlemen, we've got to take some action, and I want you to know that the action that we take could cost us our job. Because as he was sharing that with his staff, he remembered a church where an elder in the church went off the deep end. The pastor knew that he was going to have to level some stiff discipline to bring him back into the fold. And he shared it with the board of elders. And that board of elders, because the whole church, as Don Baker expressed it, had had too much diet of love and forgiveness and not enough of toughness, turned on the pastor and fired him so that they would not have to discipline the elder. Those conditions exist. And today I want to lift up three areas in our life where I think we need to be tough and tender. We need to have the strength of the Lord so that we don't rip and fall apart and bail out. One of them is in the area of our own Christian character. The scripture that David read simply said that in the latter times, that things are going to be tough. There will be deceiving spirits. There will be false prophets. There will be many, many things pulling at you to compromise. And if you would catch the tenor of that whole chapter, and that's the reason I wanted it read in its entirety, he used words such as train yourself to be like God. He said physical exercise doesn't amount to a whole lot, but spiritual exercise is really what equips us to face the rugged issues of life. Over and over you see in that 4th chapter where he was encouraging young Timothy, train your people to be tough because things are tough. And in our day, I know that there are so many temptations to take shortcuts. Oswald Chambers once said that the definition of lust is, quote, I must have it now, unquote. Ron Mell recently described temptation as being Satan's ploy to get for us now what God will give to us later on. Young people, let me tell you, that is the strength of the temptations that you will go through sexually. Satan will say, get now. But if you will hold on to God and resist that temptation, God, in the beauty of marriage, will give you a wonderful partner, and you can enjoy sex to its limit. But Satan is always saying, grab now what God will give you later. I want you to remember that. And there are three areas where this temptation comes. One is religious temptation. To know more than God really intends for us to know right now. It comes to us at our egos, to be more than God really intends for us to be right now. It comes to us materially, to have more than God really intends for us to have now. And the whole idea is the shortcut syndrome. We want everything when we want it rather than learning to wait on God. And it is a vicious, vicious temptation for the church. We have all these get-rich scams. Have it now. With God, there's always process. And you pick that up again when he says, train yourself to be godly. An athlete just doesn't get his his basketball uniform on and go out and play the game. He must exercise a great deal and work and practice so that he can really play in the arena of life. And many of us do not like the process. So there's always a temptation to have now what God will give us later on. So be tough in your character. There are always those that want to take shortcuts. At your job, there will be those that will want you to cheat, to lie, to misrepresent. In your character, there will always be those that will say, there isn't anything wrong with this activity. Why, everybody's doing it. Maybe that's just the reason you shouldn't be doing it. Be tough in your character. Formulate your convictions, and by the help and the grace of God, don't move from them. Men argue beliefs that they'll die for convictions. And I'm concerned that the modern day church is so soft in its character that in some places the church is hardly the church. Anything and everything goes. And that is disastrous, my brothers. Now, the second area I think we need to learn to be tough in is in our witness. I don't want to lay a guilt trip on anybody, because that's very easy to do when we start talking about witnessing for Christ. But evangelical Christianity is terribly weak in its witness. Let me just contrast to you the modern evangelical church with some of the explosive growth of the cults. Do you know that in 1830 there were 6 persons who band together and formed Mormonism? In 1976 there were 3.7 million Mormons. The most current statistic I have is that there are now 5.2 million Mormons. And this has to be called a cult. It is not basic mainstream Christianity. You know why they're growing like that? It is because evangelical Christianity has vacated the area of witnessing that was very strong within it. Do you know, in my lifetime, and I've been in the ministry for better than 30 years, I can only recall about 5 times when people have come up to me without working with them prior and saying, Charles, what do I have to do to be saved? Fewer than 5 persons in my lifetime have ever initiated that conversation. So if you are of the type of Christian that says, now, I'll never open my mouth about the Lord unless somebody first asks me, I want to tell you, you're safe. Chances are you can go from the age of 15 to 95 and never have to witness to the Lord. You're safe. It only happened to me 5 times. Less than 5 times. Are we going to win the world like that? Notice the difference in the reaction. Some of the cults knock on doors, door to door. And if they are persecuted for that, or put down, or cursed, they rejoice. Now, aren't I right? But most of us, we're so soft in our faith, we say, now, wait a minute, I don't like that kind of witnessing. I'm not asking you whether you like it or not. I don't particularly like it either. But I'm just pointing out how soft we are compared to what others are. They knock on doors. During the time we were surveying this immediate area, before we moved into the building, we did get some people to come and pass out literature. One of our ladies, when she was leaving the apartment, a person really let out an oath, a very unpleasant oath regarding the work. And the person that happened to said, you know, that gives you a funny feeling. Well, it does. But I would say that 95%, and I'm not talking just of our church, I'm talking about evangelical Christianity, will say, now, I'm not going to do any kind of a witnessing where people might take it wrong. And so what's going to happen? Here's the world that's going straight toward eternity without God, and here's the church that says, well, now, I'm not going to open my mouth. And so we have vacated areas, and people are going in and knocking on doors and not only sharing testimony with them or their material, but go back and back and back and get other people to move into that vacuum, and they're winning the world to their faith. But now, Pastor, pardon me, I don't like that. Do you know we need to become tough in our witness? And we need to do some things that we don't even like to do for the sake of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Now, you know I'm telling you the truth. I wish we could get a little bit tougher. I wish that if we would say, this congregation needs to cover this whole area with a witness for Christ and knock on some doors, and if people throw dirty dishwater on you, just go out and rejoice in the name of the Lord. And you know that won't happen. 75% of the people will be saying, I'm so glad you showed enough interest. I don't do enough of that. I'm guilty. Hey, I'm preaching to myself. I don't do enough of that. But I'm saying the church needs some toughness. If you want to read some thrilling chapters in the New Testament, read Acts 13 and 14 about Paul. This was on his first missionary tour. I wonder how many people would drop out of college and seminary, ministerial students, that had that experience. You remember? They went to about 3 or 4 cities there, and invariably a pattern developed. The people would at first accept them. Wow, this is great, they would say, and they would then turn right around and drive them out of the city. Paul went over to Lystra, and they even thought that he and Barnabas were gods. When they started, they said one's Hermes and the other Jupiter or someone, and they even knelt before him. Paul says, wait a minute, we're not gods. But before the day was over, they turned on them. And they stoned Paul, dragged him outside of the city limits, and left him for dead. Read about it. And some of the apostles gathered around him and prayed over him. And you know what Paul did when he revived? And this is Stuart Briscoe's comment on that particular passage. Paul said, after he got to, shook his head, wiped the blood off, he said, man, I was only in point 2 in my sermon. I've got to go back in there and give them the 3rd point in my message. Because read about it, he went back into the same city. He didn't finish his sermon, only got up to point 2. His first evangelistic and missionary tour. And we are so soft, we're afraid to witness in the office that we're believers. Betty and I, last evening, we had a wedding with a couple, and none of them belong to the church. They're non-believers. I felt like I should do the ceremony. And last night we went to the reception over on the other end of the city, and it's a different world. I mean, it's the booze flowing freely and cigarette smoke so thick I'll have to have my suit cleaned. But I'm telling you, incredibly marvelous experience. Just to move among those people and to get acquainted with them and hear someone say, oh, I like your church. I want to come. Do you know we're so soft sometimes we say, I don't want to be around a sinner. They're going to contaminate me. You don't need a sinner to contaminate you. There's powers and forces that can just flip you out, friend. You know that. You don't have to be around anyone to be tempted. That's that evil one. We need to be more tough in our witness. And I'm concerned about that in the family, that we're weak, we're soft. There's a good word that it's called apologetics, but it's when someone gives a reason for what they believe and to defend the faith. I'll tell you how soft most of us are. where Peter instructed us very carefully to always be ready to give an answer to anyone that may ask you the reason for the hope that you have in Christ. Many of us could not even explain why we're a Christian to someone else. Many. Or if someone would come up to them and say, I've got to be saved and I've got to be saved now. Would you lead me to the Lord? The first answer would be, well, I'm sorry, I'll call the pastor. I don't have time to call the pastor, man. I'm dying. I've got to have him now. Many would not even know how. That's how soft we are. You're saying, I'm not a preacher. I don't know how. That's no excuse. I don't want you to put that blame on me. There's enough books you can buy at a Christian bookstore. There's enough tapes you can listen to. You can get in the Word yourself. What happened to you in your own particular incident, you can share Jesus Christ with anyone. Say, hey, friend, I don't know how it all happens, but I can tell you how it happened to me. And that may be enough. Paul used his testimony of how he found the Lord more than any other single thing in his witnessing power. To kings, to governors. And some of us, we wouldn't say a word. We're just so soft. But in apologetics, it moves even into a different arena. This church, this body needs to become tough enough that when people begin to say, well, I'm sorry, I don't believe in Christianity. I'm a Mormon. I'm a Jehovah's Witness. I'm the other. We need to be able to defend the faith and help people out of that because I truly believe they're cults. You don't read the God makers. Read some of Martin's work. I don't particularly like Mr. Martin, but I sure do admire him. And I deeply appreciate the work that he does on the cults. It's outstanding. We need to be tough. How many of you would agree, whether you like it or not? Would you agree with me we need to be tougher? Okay. I got somebody in the back row shake their head. That's good. Thank you, Dr. Harris. Now let me move into another area. Third, we also need to be tough in our hope. Dr. Schuller, Robert Schuller, wrote a book. Tough times never last. Tough people do. And in the first chapter, he tells us about the inspiration for that book. Maybe you've read it. But in 1982, he was called to address a group of those people involved in the agricultural business in the downtown Hilton in Chicago. There were 3,500 farmers gathered there in that big fellowship room, and he was to speak to these farmers to give them some encouragement and hope. But before he went out on the platform, two men met him. And they addressed him with words like this, Dr. Schuller, we're glad you're here. But he said the quality of their voice, their attitude, their whole demeanor sounded exactly like a family that had experienced a death. And when you walk into the room, they say, Pastor Tarr, we're glad you're here. And they literally blocked the hallway where he was going to go out on the platform and said, Dr. Schuller, we've got to tell you something. There are 3,500 farmers out there that are having it tough. And we do not want you to get up there and crack 3 jokes and give that big television smile of yours. These people are desperate. They need to give hope. And about that time, he heard the announcer saying, and now, ladies and gentlemen, here is Dr. Robert Schuller. And he was walking out on the stage. He said, well, how am I going to start this thing? They just ruined my introduction. I don't have my 3 funny stories to tell. And all of a sudden, he remembered a principle. They said that relating experiences where you gained hope is always inspiring. And he began to tell the people, yes, these are tough times. It was tough on the farmers in 1982. And if I know anything about the situation, it's even tougher in 1985. But when Schuller was addressing them, he told a couple of stories about his father and about his own life. I didn't know them before, maybe you did. But when he was a boy, their family was so poor on the Iowa farm. They didn't have money one winter to buy coal, and he said that he was sure that family would have nearly frozen to death if they had not had to do what his father told him to do, and that was to go out into the pig pen and get every corn cob they could find to use it for fuel. Can you imagine that man that stands on television in that huge glass cathedral, a little young guy in overalls out in a pig pen, watching his steps very carefully, if you know what I mean, picking up every corn cob that was there to take it back to the stove to burn for fuel. But he said, we made it. And he told of another incident when he was in college. He came home for one break, semester break. And his father by this time had 11 buildings built on their farm, all newly painted. And in just a short time, the mortgage was going to be paid off. And everything was looking great for his father and his mother, when all of a sudden they spotted a black funnel in a cloud. And his father said, Robert, quickly get in the car. Get your mother. Get out of here. They jumped in the car and for about a mile had to go straight toward that funnel before they could turn off the road and go in another direction. They went and waited for about a half hour, 45 minutes. And then they came, as that funnel, tornado as it moved through, they went back. When they got near their farmhouse, they began to see people already gathering, looking at the devastation of the nearby farm. And they wondered, wow, did this hit us? And they came up on a rise where they should have been able to see their barn. They didn't see anything. They knew it had hit. And when they got to the place where they could see the whole farm, there wasn't anything left. There was hardly any debris because that tornado literally carried everything away. Nothing left but the white foundations of those 11 buildings. As they got into the area, they did see here was a dead pig, Mother Sow, with 3 little piglets sucking on a dead mother. And the horse that Robert had been riding just before his father told him to come in lay dead with the 2x4 piercing its body. And his father walked through some of the devastation. Wasn't much there, but what little was there. And he found a little piece of a plaque that they kept in their home that originally said, keep looking to Jesus. But even it too was broken. The only thing that was left were the first 2 words, keep looking. And he brought it back to the car. And he told his wife, he said, honey, 26 years of our life was destroyed in 10 minutes. What will we do? But he had that plaque in his hand, and together they said, we've got to keep looking. I don't understand why those things occur. But I do know that if you're going to make it, you've got to be tough in your character. You need to be tough in your witness, and you must be tough in hope. Because if you give up, every time you go through a little bit of a problem, you're going to be washed away. You just are. With every reversal, you're going to be swept asunder. With every problem, you're going to be throwing in the towel and quitting. And you need to be tough in your hope that as long as you stay with Christ, He's with you, whatever you're going through. And Robert Schuler's father and mother looked at that plaque and just said, keep looking. And it gave them the inspiration to hold on. They bought a part of a house where it had been partially devastated. They bought the rest of the house for $50, tore it apart, board by board, nail by nail, and started rebuilding. And in 6 years, they had the farm built back. Oh, how we need to be tough. You need to be a tough Christian so that you can make it. Would you bow your heads with me? Father, it seems at times that we all look out on our farms and every building has been leveled. Sometimes we look at our family and everything that we have poured into it seems to be swept away. I pray, Father, that you'd give us some spiritual toughness today to endure as a good soldier of the cross in the army of the Lord. In Christ's name, amen. Let us stand as we sing, please.